Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and I am here with our resident expert in systems analysis. We're jumping right in today because we have a lot to unpack for you.
Right, and it's a massive topic. Glad to be here.
So usually, when we think about why civilizations collapse, we tend to look for the meteor.
Oh, yeah, the big external shock.
Exactly. And I don't mean a literal rock falling from space, though. I mean, that obviously qualifies. But we look for the sudden, overwhelming external event, like an invasion by a massive foreign army or some unforeseen natural disaster.
A global pandemic that just halts commerce overnight.
Right. We are completely obsessed with the idea that destruction is something that happens to us.
Well, I mean, the psychological appeal of that meteor myth is just massive.
That's for sure.
Because think about it, if a society's collapse is caused by this unpredictable, overwhelming force like a black swan event, then the people who built that society are totally absolved of responsibility.
Right. It's like if a meteor hits your house, your neighbors don't blame you for building a weak roof.
Exactly. The prevailing logic is always, well, the system was fine, we just had really bad luck, we were victims of circumstance. And that preserves the ego of the civilization.
But, and this is where it gets interesting for you listening, when you actually step into the world of hard civilizational design, you start looking at the mechanics, the sociology, the systems engineering.
The resource distribution networks.
Yeah. And you realize that true systems engineers, they do not buy the meteor excuse at all. They look at the internal telemetry.
Right, because that catastrophic failure isn't falling from the sky.
No, it's being meticulously constructed, brick by brick, policy by policy, by the exact people who are going to be crushed when the roof eventually caves in.
It's the absolute definition of a structural inevitability, because when a system operates on flawed physics, and I mean socioeconomic physics here, it doesn't need an external shock to destroy it.
It's actively destroying itself.
Right, through its own baseline daily operations. It's just accumulating internal stress, basically waiting for the mathematical reality to exceed the load-bearing capacity of the structure.
So the collapse isn't an event at all. It's just a process that finally reaches its terminal limit.
Exactly.
Now, you're probably listening to this thinking, okay, I tuned in for a deep dive on historical texts. Why are we talking about structural engineering?
Because they are the exact same thing in this content.
Right. And that is exactly what we are decoding today. We are looking at a fascinating lecture from 1979 delivered by G.A. Parwez.
A truly brilliant piece of analysis.
Yeah, he takes this foundational 7th century text, Surah As-Sajdah, specifically verses 14 through 19, and he completely re-engineers how we read it.
Because for centuries, those verses have been wrapped up in, dense layers of mysticism and ritual.
That's sentimentality.
Right. And Parwez just strips all of that away. We are not looking at this as a religious sermon today.
Not at all.
We are looking at it as a masterclass in the architecture of human societies, how they scale and how they engineer their own doom.
And the framework he uses is essentially a comparative output analysis.
What's fascinating here is that the core thesis of these verses, once you look at the raw Arabic mechanics, is that human systems that align with productive laws thrive. Period.
And systems rooted in a persistent denial of reality, they structurally collapse.
Exactly. This text isn't describing, divine mood swings. It is describing the immutable laws of input and output.
Okay, let's plunge right into the anatomy of this collapse. Because the text starts by just completely exploding what I call the geography myth.
Oh, this is such a crucial point.
Right, so verse 14, the traditional translation sounds something like, quote, "So taste the punishment because you forgot the meeting of this day of yours."
And the Orthodox reading converts that entire concept into a geographic and temporal destination.
Yeah, heaven and hell are treated like actual physical coordinates on a map. And the day is like a calendar appointment.
A scheduled court date.
Right, a judge bangs a gavel and hands out your sentence. But Parwez completely dismantles that.
He zeroes in on the mechanism of the word tasting. Because the text doesn't say, you will be transported to a place of punishment.
It implies the tasting is happening now.
Exactly. It's a structural description of a society's current operational state. If you build an economic engine based on, say, the infinite deferral of blowback, you aren't waiting for a future court date.
You're already tasting the structural decay in the present tense.
Right.
But wait, let me push back on that timeline a bit. Because if a society builds a completely exploitative economic system, but the people at the top are living in mansions and the stock market is just booming.
They don't feel like they're tasting punishment.
Right. They feel like they're winning. So how does the text reconcile the fact that a failing system can look incredibly successful for like decades before it breaks?
Well, that is exactly what forgetting the meeting of the day addresses.
Okay.
Forgetting here isn't a cognitive lapse. It's not like misplacing your car
All
keys.
right.
It is the active, systemic ignorance of the consequence cycle. Think about the 2008 global financial crisis.
Oh, perfect example.
Right. For years, financial institutions were packaging these highly toxic mortgages into securities.
And selling them as pristine assets.
Exactly. And the bankers at the top were making unprecedented bonuses. The market was roaring. So if you just looked at the surface, they were winning.
But the bad math was already written into the ledger.
Right. They had forgotten the day, meaning they operated under this total delusion that the mathematical reality of those defaults would never arrive.
So the day isn't a judge arriving to punish the bankers.
No.
The day is simply the Tuesday morning, when the number of defaults mathematically exceeds the liquidity of the banks holding the asset.
Well, precisely. The day is just the math catching up with you.
Wow. So is the inevitable arrival of the reality that they were continuously building.
When engineers design a suspension bridge, they have to account for universal productive laws: gravity, wind resistance, tensile strength.
Right? Physics.
Yeah. And if they were defiant to those laws, like say they use cheaper, brittle steel to save money.
And they miscalculate the load dynamics.
Exactly. The bridge doesn't collapse because physics becomes angry with them on a specific date. Physics is entirely neutral.
The day of the bridge is just the exact microsecond that the physical tension exceeds the molecular bonds of that cheap steel.
Yes.
But the failure was guaranteed the moment they poured the bad concrete.
They built the collapse into the structure on day one.
And the society Parwez is analyzing here, the one tasting the punishment, they are experiencing the friction of that bad design long before the bridge actually falls into the river.
You see it in the societal anxiety, the massive wealth inequality.
The hollowing out of the middle class.
Exactly. The degradation of the ecological base. That socioeconomic friction is the tasting.
It totally shifts the paradigm of accountability, doesn't it? From this deferred, mystical future to a relentless, computed present.
The consequence cycle never stops running in the background.
Every policy decision, every instance of systemic hoarding, it's an input into the ledger. You don't have to wait to be punished. You are just living inside a failing machine.
And the anxiety of maintaining that unnatural, imbalanced system is its own immediate consequence.
Which implies a terrifying level of strictness to reality. Because if bad math guarantees a collapse, then subjective intentions literally do not matter.
They don't.
You could have a society full of people who genuinely mean well. They think they're doing the right thing, but their systems are built on bad physics. The bridge still falls.
That's the hard truth of systems engineering.
But I mean, it also implies the inverse, right? If bad math guarantees destruction, then good math must guarantee stability.
Yes, exactly.
So how does a civilization actually build the bridge that stands forever?
Well, that requires transitioning from the anatomy of collapse to the architecture of alignment, which brings us to the linguistic core of Parwez's analysis in verse 15.
Okay, let's get into the linguistics.
The text describes those who recognize these productive laws as those who, quote, fall prostrate, unquote, the Arabic root being sajda.
And here is where we have to strip away centuries of accumulated ritual.
Oh, absolutely.
Because for you, the listener, the average person hears the word prostrate, and it conjures a very specific passive image.
Right, you bow your head to the floor.
You face a certain direction, you mumble a set phrase, and you check a compliance box.
It's a transaction of obedience.
Yeah, it's steeped in this feudal subservience, like, I made myself small, therefore the supreme authority will spare me.
And Parwez argues that interpreting sajda as just a physical posture is one of the most debilitating errors in civilizational history.
That's a strong claim.
It reduces a massive systemic mandate to a superstitious ritual. Sajda, in the context of systems engineering, means full, total structural alignment.
Okay, unpack that.
It means that every single faculty of a civilization, its monetary policy, its jurisprudence, its scientific research, is oriented toward and perfectly aligned with objective, productive laws.
So, going back to the engineering analogy, if you are designing an airplane, you don't build a square, heavy box, paint it blue, and then bow down and pray to the wind that it will fly.
No, your entire design has to be in sajda to the laws of aerodynamics.
Every rivet, the precise curvature of the airfoil, the thrust-to-weight ratio, it all has to perfectly conform to the reality of fluid dynamics.
Exactly. And notice the psychology of that airplane wing. The wing doesn't view conforming to aerodynamics as a defeat or like a humiliating submission.
Right, it's not oppressed by the air.
No, it utilizes the air pressure. By aligning with a universal law that is vastly more powerful than itself, the wing achieves lift.
So sajda is not subservience, it is the ultimate pragmatism.
It is the recognition of objective reality and the meticulous conforming of your systems to operate flawlessly within that reality, so your civilization can achieve lift.
But wait, if aerodynamics is an objective universal law, why doesn't an engineer just close their eyes, trust the universe, and slap the plane together? Like, the law is perfect, so I just need to believe in it. There is a huge danger here of interpreting this alignment as blind faith.
And the text anticipates that exact danger. This is where Parwez brings in a crucial cross-reference from another chapter, verse 2573, to totally shatter the idea of blind obedience.
What does that verse say?
It states explicitly that true participants in this system, when presented with universal laws, do not fall deaf and blind before them.
Wow. See, here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because that completely rewires the traditional religious paradigm.
Totally.
Usually the highest compliment you can give a believer in an orthodox system is that they have unquestioning faith.
Right. They just accept it because an authority figure said so.
But the text is actively condemning that. It is saying that if you approach the foundation of reality deaf and blind, you're doing it fundamentally wrong.
Because blind faith is structurally identical to ignorance. You cannot achieve systemic alignment if you don't understand the mechanisms of the system. Parwez emphasizes that the highest state of alignment requires ilmo basirat.
Which translates to what, exactly?
Profound reason, verifiable knowledge, and deep critical insight.
Okay, so if an aerospace engineer blindly copies a schematic of a jet engine without understanding thermodynamics, they haven't aligned with physics.
No, they've just submitted to a dictation.
And the danger of that is, what happens when the engine encounters an anomaly?
Exactly. What happens when you fly into a storm with different air densities?
The engineer who just copied the schematic blindly doesn't know why the engine works, so they have zero capacity to fix it.
But the engineer with ilmo basirat, who has tested the metals, who understands the mathematical equations,
They can innovate. They can solve the problem.
the system demands operators who understand the source code. Dictators, cult leaders, human power structures, they demand blind obedience because their systems are fundamentally irrational.
Right, they can't withstand scrutiny.
But universal objective laws actually want to be understood. A system only functions at peak efficiency when its operators possess total cognitive awareness of the mechanics.
The text is demanding an engine of reason.
You are instructed to test the socioeconomic laws, observe their historical outcomes, scrutinize the data, and implement them consciously.
So sajda isn't a state of passive surrender at all. It's a state of hyper-rational, calculated alignment.
Precisely.
But, calculating the math isn't the same as actually building the plane. You can have a perfect blueprint for a thriving society, but blueprints don't build themselves.
Oh, they require labor.
And this leads right into a linguistic deep dive that genuinely shocked me when I first read the source material.
The execution phase.
Yeah, still in verse 15, we hit two concepts that follow this alignment. Tasbah and hamd, traditionally translated as glorification and praise.
Which brings us to the myth of the rosary bead.
Right. If sajda was reduced to just bowing down, tasbih was reduced to an even more passive state.
The prevailing historical image is someone retreating from the world, sitting in a quiet, dimly lit room, rolling a string of beads through their fingers and whispering a phrase over and over again.
And Parwez just bypasses centuries of that accumulated mysticism. He analyzes the literal Arabic root of the word used for tasbih, which is sabaha.
And the root sabaha has absolutely nothing to do with whispering quietly in a corner.
It is the exact opposite.
It really is.
Yeah.
In classical Arabic, the root describes the extreme, lung-busting.
Imagine taking a society that believes the highest form of virtue is sitting silently counting beads and telling them, no, the text actually demands the physical output of an Olympic swimmer fighting a riptide.
Muscles burning, lungs screaming for oxygen.
That fundamentally rewrites the sociology of the civilization. Tasbih isn't passive meditation. It is continuous, maximum effort action in alignment with the law.
If sajda is the intellectual blueprint perfectly aligned with reality, tasbih is the engine running at maximum RPM to physically construct that reality.
You cannot build an equitable, thriving civilization by sitting still and muttering nice words.
You build it through relentless, exhausting, highly coordinated physical and intellectual labor.
And Parwez illustrates the absurdity of the traditional view with this incredibly sharp anecdote in the lecture.
Oh, the Hindu ledger system.
Yes, he talks about a historical ledger system used in a village. A man decides he wants to accumulate spiritual merit, so he resolves to recite a specific phrase 900,000 times.
But human memory can't track that.
Obviously not. So he hires a local accountant, and the accountant figures out how to mathematically document his recitations on a physical ledger, using thumbprints and tally marks.
It's delivered as a dry joke, but it's actually a devastating critique.
It really is. It's the perfect diagnosis of a dying civilization.
Because they have reduced the monumental, structurally complex mandate of building a thriving society to a literal data entry job of meaningless syllables.
They've created a total illusion of productivity.
The man looks at his ledger, sees 900,000 tally marks, and truly believes he has achieved ultimate success.
Meanwhile, outside his window, the actual world, the economy, the infrastructure, the agriculture is crumbling into ruin.
Because no one is actually doing the hard, physical work of Sabaha.
They think they are hoarding points in some invisible cosmic bank account, but the bridge is collapsing under their feet.
Look at my ledger. I've got 900,000 points.
Right. I'm a saint.
Yes.
But your neighbor is starving, the water supply is poisoned, and your society is completely vulnerable. You aren't doing the work.
And this systemic failure also corrupts the meaning of the next word, hamd.
Right.
If tasbih is the maximum effort, hamd is the societal reaction to the result of that effort.
Usually hamd is translated simply as verbal praise or flattery. Like, oh, you are so great, you are so powerful.
Which again projects petty, fragile, human ego dynamics onto universal systems.
Sounds like a peasant trying to flatter a volatile feudal king so he doesn't raise the taxes. You are the greatest king, please don't burn my village.
Right, but the universe doesn't have an ego. It doesn't need your flattery.
So what is hamd then?
Parwez argues that hamd, in a systemic context, is the spontaneous, entirely involuntary reaction of awe that escapes you when you observe a flawlessly executing perfect system.
It is the objective acknowledgement of peak competence.
Exactly.
I think of this like watching a SpaceX rocket launch.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Or more specifically, watching the booster rocket detach in the upper atmosphere, fall back to Earth, ignite its thrusters at the exact right millisecond, and land perfectly upright on a drone ship in the middle of the ocean.
It's incredible to watch.
When you watch that happen, you don't say wow to flatter the rocket. The rocket is a piece of metal. It doesn't care about your feelings.
Right.
You say wow because the sheer undeniable competence of the engineering, the beauty of the mathematics, making this massive machine do exactly what it's supposed to do, it literally compels the admiration from you.
You cannot help but praise the perfection of the design.
That is the essence of systemic hamd.
When a society actually aligns its socio-economic structure through Sajdah and puts in the galloping horse effort of tasbih, the resulting civilization is so productive, so beautifully balanced, that anyone who observes it is forced to say, what an incredible system.
Look how flawlessly it provides for everyone.
That acknowledgement of absolute structural perfection is hamd. The system's success generates its own undeniable praise.
It demands a society of vigilant operators and engineers, not passive worshippers. Which brings us perfectly to the next operational requirement in verse 16.
It moves from the abstract principles of effort into the hardcore logistical economics.
Right, the provision and circulation. The text describes these aligned individuals as those whose, quote, sides forsake their beds and who, quote, give from what they are provided.
And again, the ascetic lens distorts this completely.
Oh, totally. The ascetic reads forsaking beds and concludes that the highest form of devotion is sleep deprivation.
They think it means waking up at 3 a.m., sitting in the freezing dark to perform lonely rituals, and deliberately suffering.
And Parwez violently rejects the idea that suffering or self-deprivation is inherently noble.
Because a society run by exhausted, sleep-deprived people is going to make terrible logistical decisions.
Obviously. If you stay awake all night muttering to yourself, you are going to be useless during the day when the actual work of running the society needs to be done.
Forsaking beds is a metaphor. It's the operating posture of the hypervigilant agent.
Okay, explain that.
If you manage a complex, mission-critical system, say you are the lead engineer for a national power grid, or you run the server farms for global financial transactions.
You don't just clock out at 5 p.m.
Exactly. You don't turn off your phone and assume everything will be perfectly fine until morning. Entropy doesn't sleep.
The consequence cycle doesn't take a nap.
Right. You build in redundancies. You have night shifts. You have automated alerts that wake you up if a node fails. You are always monitoring because you know that complex systems tend toward chaos if left unattended.
It's the mindset of constant readiness. It's not about hating sleep. It's about understanding the stakes of the mission so deeply that you refuse to be complacent.
Exactly.
But what exactly are they being vigilant about? The verse says they give from what they are provided. Parwez analyzes two specific economic terms here that sound like they belong in a modern supply chain textbook.
Risk and infaq.
Let's tackle risk first, because usually it just gets translated as food or provision.
And translating it merely as food misses the entire logistical dimension. Parwez defines risk not just as the raw resource, but as a delivery of the exact required resource, in the precise quantity needed at the exact microsecond it is required.
To ensure the growth and functionality of a specific node in the system.
Exactly. Timing is baked into the very definition.
Parwez uses the example of feeding a baby, right? Which perfectly clarifies this.
It does. If a baby is crying for milk at 2 p.m. because its biology requires those specific nutrients right then for cellular development, and you finally give it milk at 6 p.m.
You provided food, but you failed to provide risk.
Right. The delay caused friction, stress, and halted optimal development. Risk requires precise logistical timing.
Yeah, scale that up to macroeconomics.
Okay, think about global manufacturing. If a supply chain delivers a massive shipment of raw steel to a car factory 3 months after the factory had to halt production and lay off workers due to a shortage.
The supply chain has delivered steel, but it has catastrophically failed to deliver risk.
Yes. The system Parwez is outlining is one where resource allocation is so finely tuned, perhaps through advanced information networks, that every citizen, every industry, every hospital receives exactly what it needs to function.
Exactly when it needs it. It's the ultimate just-in-time logistics applied to human thriving.
But delivering the resource is only half the equation. What happens to the resource once it arrives?
That brings us to infaq. The text says they give from what is provided.
Infaq is the foundational principle of circulation. In any living biological system, flow is the definition of life.
Right, blood must circulate.
If blood pools and stagnates in one area of the body, it forms a clot, the surrounding tissue becomes necrotic, and the organism dies.
And in socioeconomic systems, if wealth or resources or land pool in the hands of a few,
which is hoarding or monopolization,
the economic engine seizes up. The periphery of the society starves from scarcity, while the center rots from excess and inflation.
Infaq means keeping the system open. It demands frictionless output as much as input.
So you receive the perfectly timed resource, the risk, you utilize the exact amount you need to sustain your own optimal function, and then you immediately release the excess into the network.
So it can flow to where it is needed next.
You don't build a dam to hoard the river for yourself. You build a canal to ensure the next field down the valley gets irrigated.
Hoarding is the ultimate systemic friction. It creates artificial scarcity, and artificial scarcity leads to desperation, which leads to conflict, crime, and vast expenditures on security just to protect the hoarded wealth.
That friction is exactly what causes the structural collapse we talked about at the very beginning.
Right. A society operating on Sajdah is defined by the high velocity of circulation. Resources move continuously, driven by the hypervigilance of the operators.
It is an economy of flow, completely devoid of the systemic clots of accumulation.
It's an incredibly high standard.
Okay, yeah, let's zoom out and look at the terrifyingly high standard we've just built. We are looking at a society rationally aligned with objective physics, working with the lung-busting exertion of a galloping horse.
Managing global resources with microsecond precision.
And circulating everything instantly without a single billionaire hoarding it. Let me be honest, that sounds exhausting.
It does sound incredibly demanding.
It's a hyper-optimized civilization. Why would humanity put itself through that level of rigorous discipline? What is the actual payoff?
This leads us to verse 17, which introduces a concept that is mathematically and philosophically radical.
The output of this perfectly optimized system.
The traditional translation reads, quote, "No soul knows what has been hidden for them of comfort for eyes as reward for what they used to do."
And in Orthodox frameworks, believers expect a very specific, detailed brochure of rewards.
Perform these daily rituals and you will receive a mansion made of pearls, a river of milk, and endless luxury.
It's a static product catalog.
But the text deliberately refuses to give you the catalog. It says no soul knows.
Now, some people read that and think, oh, it's just a secret surprise party.
Yeah.
The reward is in a box and I don't get to open it yet.
But Parwez argues this is a profound statement about the asymmetry of productive laws and human consciousness, or SURE.
The asymmetry, explain that.
Well, the downside of misalignment, the collapsing bridge, the crumbling empire, is linear, visible, and deeply documented in our history books.
We know exactly what failure looks like.
Right. But the upside of persistent, flawless systemic alignment scales exponentially. The future rewards of a perfectly aligned society literally cannot be comprehended by the current limited mindset of the people building it.
Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a human being living in the year 1100 AD, an agrarian serf.
Okay.
If you tried to explain the internet to them, or mapping the human genome, or quantum computing, or eradicating smallpox, their consciousness, their SURE, literally lacked the neurological and conceptual framework to process those ideas.
Absolutely.
If you asked that medieval farmer what the ultimate reward for a good society would be, he wouldn't say a supercomputer. He'd say a horse that never gets tired, and maybe a year without the bubonic plague.
His imagination is bounded by his era's friction. And the text is stating that if a civilization truly aligns its structure and runs the engine of reason at full capacity, the evolutionary leap it takes will produce a reality so advanced your current brain cannot formulate a thought about it.
The output exceeds the calculator's current processing power. But hold on, let me put my systems engineer hat back on and push back here.
Go for it.
Engineers despise unknown variables. They like blueprints. They need to know the exact load-bearing dimensions of the skyscraper before they pour a single yard of concrete.
Right.
So if you are asking a society to exert galloping horse effort, but you tell them, hey, I won't tell you what the final building looks like, isn't that just a different, more sophisticated flavor of blind faith? How do you engineer toward an unknown outcome?
That is the genius of the system's architecture. You are not asked to blindly trust the outcome. You are asked to trust the input.
Trust the input.
The physics of the system are observable and historically verifiable. We know mathematically that Sajdah, Tasbih, and Infaq produce surplus, stability, and technological leaps.
We have the historical data on that.
Right. The system says optimize the inputs flawlessly and let the algorithm run. You don't need to know the final output if you have absolute verified confidence in the integrity of the process.
Okay. It's like planting an acorn.
Exactly.
I cannot mathematically calculate exactly how many branches the oak tree will have in 100 years. I don't know the exact vector of every single leaf.
But you don't need to know.
No, because I know the genetic code inside the acorn is perfect. If I provide the right soil, the exact right water, the rizq, and maximum sunlight, the correct inputs, the resulting tree will be magnificent.
Even if its exact geometry is a mystery to you today, you trust the code, not a psychic vision of the tree.
And this requires true intellectual humility, which loops back to Ilmo Basirat, the reason and insight.
A truly rational mind understands its own epistemic limits. It knows that human consciousness is a waypoint, not a final destination.
It's willing to participate in a system that scales beyond its own predictive models.
It is only the arrogance of the small, fragile mind that demands a guaranteed static product catalog before it deigns to do any work.
Which steers us directly into the massive sociological roadblock.
The ego.
Yes. If this system is so logically sound, if the inputs are clearly defined, and if it promises an open-ended evolutionary leap, why is human history basically a highlight reel of us doing the exact opposite?
This is a fair question.
Why do we hoard? Why do we oppress? Why do we knowingly build failing bridges?
Parwez addresses this by making a brilliant psychological distinction between two concepts that modern culture almost entirely conflates. The self, which represents true elevation, ulu, and the ego, which represents false arrogance, istakbar, big hair, al-Haq.
This is the root cause of systemic failure. Let's unpack those.
Yeah.
Ulu and istakbar. They both roughly translate to being elevated or being high up.
But the structural reality of how they get high up is completely opposite.
Right.
The self, ulu, achieves elevation by integrating with objective truth. It submits its operations to the productive laws. By aligning with a universal system that is infinitely greater than itself, the self is organically elevated along with the system.
It achieves genuine greatness through contribution and mastery, like the aerospace engineer.
Exactly. The engineer yields completely to the laws of aerodynamics. They don't fight gravity, they study it and utilize it.
And as a result of that submission to the truth, they build a rocket that goes to the moon. The engineer becomes historically significant because they submitted to the rules. Their elevation is earned and structural.
Contrast that with the ego. Istakbar bigher al-haq. The phrase bigher al-haq is the key. It means without truth, without right, or lacking justification.
Unearned.
Right. The ego is terrified of yielding to objective truth because it views any submission, even to undeniable math or physics, as a personal insult to its autonomy.
To feel big, the ego relies on brute force, artificial hierarchy, and systemic oppression.
Parwez uses the historical archetype of Pharaoh from the source text as the ultimate case study of the ego.
And what's fascinating is that Parwez points out Pharaoh wasn't stupid. He wasn't lacking data.
Inwardly, his intellect recognized the truth of the equitable systems being presented to him by Moses. His brain did the math.
He saw the logic of a system without enslaved classes.
But his ego actively, violently blocked his alignment, because yielding to that objective truth would mean dismantling his artificial elevation.
It would mean stepping down from his status as a living god.
The ego would literally rather rule as a tyrant over a collapsing, impoverished, diseased system than be a perfectly aligned, equal, and productive component in a thriving one.
The ego is fundamentally irrational.
It demands that people bow to it, rather than bowing with people to the truth.
There's a quote in Parwez's text from the Urdu poet Jigar Muradabadi that completely encapsulates this psychological barrier. He uses the phrase shikaste fatiana, which translates to victorious defeat.
It is one of the most stunning paradoxes in literature. It perfectly captures the internal psychology of Sajdah.
Yielding to the ultimate truth, admitting that your hoarded wealth or your exploitative business model violates the laws of reality, it feels like a massive defeat to the fragile ego.
The ego screams, I lost. I had to admit I was wrong.
Right, I had to bow down to a law bigger than my own desires. But because you were aligning with the immutable architecture of reality, that defeat of the ego is actually the ultimate civilizational victory.
By letting the ego lose, the society wins open-ended evolution.
That initial feeling of defeat is the primary barrier to human progress. We cling to our broken economic models, our prejudices, because they give us a false sense of control.
We want to be right more than we want to be effective.
The system demands the absolute annihilation of that false ego. You have to undergo the shikasta fatahana. You have to lose your arrogance to win the future.
And if you refuse, if a CEO or a politician or an entire generation refuses to undergo that victorious defeat,
what happens then? Well, the system doesn't write you a strongly worded letter. It just processes your input.
Which brings us to the climactic output analysis. The law of requital, or mukafat amal. This is verses 18 and 19.
Here, the engineering, the economics, and the psychology all converge into a final, inescapable equation.
Verse 18 asks a seemingly rhetorical question. Quote, is one who was a believer like one who was defiantly disobedient? They are not equal.
Now, a superficial, traditional reading sees this as purely a moral judgment. Like, the good guys go to the good place, the bad guys go to the bad place. The cosmic authority likes Group A and dislikes Group B.
But Parwez rips that apart. This isn't morality. This is a hard systems claim.
It is the assertion that different inputs physically mandate different outputs.
It's like asking, is an airplane designed according to fluid dynamics equal to a brick with wings glued to it?
Obviously not.
They're not equal. One will achieve lift and one will plummet to the earth. It is not because the sky judges the brick as morally evil.
It is because the brick fundamentally violates the structural laws of flight. The sky is neutral. It simply enforces the physics.
The law of requital is just the principle of inherent causality. Reality guarantees that consequences will perfectly match actions.
A society that operates on Sajdah and Infaq generates a completely different output than a society that operates on istikbar and hoarding. They cannot end up in the same place. It's mathematically impossible.
But this brings up a huge loophole that human beings constantly try to exploit.
Oh, the good deeds loophole.
Right. And Parwez addresses this head-on by bringing in another verse, 46:20. People will say, okay, maybe I don't align with this overarching, exhausting system of universal laws.
Maybe I don't believe in this open-ended evolutionary future.
Right, I just believe in the here and now. But I do good deeds. I donate to charity, I build a wing on a hospital, I'm polite to my employees. Don't I get a payout for that?
I bought my indulgence. Where is my ticket to the evolutionary upside? How does the system handle the philanthropist who made his money through an exploitative monopoly?
The system handles it with breathtaking, ruthless fairness.
Okay, lay it out.
Parwez points out the transactional nature of those actions. If you operate exclusively within the framework of earthly, immediate systems. If your actual goal is social status, immediate economic return, or just leaving a legacy,
Then the system pays you out in that exact immediate currency.
the transaction clears.
You get the massive tax write-off. You get the hospital wing named after you. People applaud you as the charity gala. You wanted earthly validation, and the earth validated you.
The account is settled. Zero balance.
Wow.
You aimed for a short-term, earthly output, and you received it. But you cannot then arrive at the threshold of the next evolutionary track, the one requiring deep structural alignment and the lung-busting effort of TASB and demand entry.
You structurally denied that future existed.
You didn't invest a single ounce of effort into it. You cannot claim an output in a system you fundamentally refuse to provide inputs for.
It's like buying a ticket for a train to Chicago. You enjoy the ride to Chicago, you eat a great meal in the dining car, you get off at Union Station in Chicago, and then you start screaming at the conductor because you aren't in Tokyo.
That's the perfect analogy.
The system looks at you and says, you didn't buy a ticket to Tokyo. You didn't even believe the Tokyo train existed. You optimized your entire journey for Chicago, and you got exactly what you paid for.
It is entirely fair, but it completely dismantles the entitlement of the ego.
The ego wants to operate according to its own flawed, short-term, hoarded rules, but it wants the infinite, open-ended rewards of the perfected system.
And the law of requital says no. The tracks are mathematically distinct. Persistent alignment leads to open-ended evolution. Persistent denial leads to the earthly payout, followed by structural irrelevance and eventual collapse.
So as we synthesize this incredibly dense journey, let's look at the permanence of these laws versus the changing ideologies we deal with today. We started by looking for the dramatic meteor, and we realized the meteor is just the internal stress we build ourselves. We've mapped the architecture of alignment, the exhausting, continuous effort of TESB.
The hyper-vigilant economics of perfectly timed resources, risk, and, in fact,
The psychology of the ego versus the self, and finally, the inescapable mathematics of causality.
the permanent principle that Parwaz extracts from these verses is that persistent alignment and persistent denial produce structurally different outcomes. This is the universe's operational manual.
It doesn't change based on what century you live in.
No, it doesn't.
And understanding that permanence is so critical right now, because we live in an era absolutely saturated with shifting ideologies. Every day there's a new philosophy, a new thought leader trying to convince us of outcome equivalence.
Right, the idea that all paths lead to the same place.
Or there's no objective truth, so just do what feels right to you. Or success is mostly just luck, so why exert the effort?
Those modern ideologies are the ultimate comfort food for the ego. They absolve us of the rigorous, exhausting work of Sajdah and Tasbih.
If all paths lead to the same place, then I don't have to put in the lung-busting effort to swim against the current. I can just float downstream and assume I'll end up at the summit.
But the comparative output analysis we just decoded stands absolutely firm against that comforting illusion. The universe is not a casino, and all paths do not lead to the summit.
Input determines output. The tracks are not equal. You cannot build a bridge with cheap steel and bad math and expect it to stand just because you meant well or because you felt you were on your own personal truth journey.
The bridge falls. Gravity doesn't care about your personal journey.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. We've spent this entire deep dive dissecting macro-civilizational design, global supply chains, empires, societal collapse. But a civilization is just an aggregate of individuals.
It's made of you and me. The macro system is entirely dependent on the micro-operators.
Right. If Sajdah isn't just a physical posture you strike for a few minutes a day to check a religious box, but rather the total structural alignment of your resources, your intellect, and your daily actions to the reality of consequence, then you have to rigorously audit your own operations.
You really do.
Look at your own daily life. The way you work, the way you consume, the way you treat the people in your network, the way you manage your ego when someone proves you wrong.
Are you operating with ilmu basarat, reason, knowledge, and deep insight?
Are you truly aligned with the productive laws that generate growth and frictionless circulation? Or are you just sitting quietly, counting tally marks on a ledger, hoping the bridge doesn't collapse beneath you before you get to the other side?
It is the ultimate question of agency. Are you putting in the galloping horse effort to build the open-ended future, or are you just waiting to taste the punishment of a poorly designed present?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep your systems aligned.